express gratitude for the opportunity to be with you this afternoon and talk a little bit about church preparedness. And Brother Dennis Lifrith, the Managing Director of the Welfare Services Department, will join me in making that presentation. And then at the conclusion, we'll invite our guests to come and participate in a little bit of a discussion with you, if we may. The people who are on the front lines and the people who really understand what is taking place as we think about church preparedness in a very broad fashion. But to understand church preparedness, we really have to have a little bit of an understanding that the pillar of church preparedness is really family preparedness. And we are, as an institution, about only as strong as we have families who are prepared for whatever eventuality may come their way. Family preparedness is the foundation. It's really the foundation of church preparedness, and we depend on the families in the church to provide that pillar. You'll recall that after a General Welfare Committee discussion a little over a year ago, it was determined that we needed to simplify the message to families. And that simplification included to gradually, weekly and daily, start that little preparation process, and gradually over time acquire a 3-month supply of the things you use every day, accompanied with a quantity of drinking water. To start, if you have not already, a financial reserve, even if it's only a few cents a day. And to then, when you've accomplished those first 3 bullets, then start thinking about the longer term. The wheat, the beans, the powdered milk, the other kinds of things that can sustain life over a long period of time. It's that pillar of family preparedness that everything else in terms of the institutional church is predicated upon. And so the purposes then of church preparedness comes to the point that as an institution we provide life-sustaining assistance for the ongoing poor and the needy who have claim on the church. We will always have the poor amongst us, even though self-reliance is the key to what we do. We will always have a portion of our population who will be in need. We provide life-sustaining assistance for church members who are displaced or unable to provide for themselves because of conditions beyond their control. And we're then talking about the emergencies, several of which we have had in the last several days and weeks. And the others to the extent that the church has resources in cooperation with community agencies. Thanks to the generosity of our folks, we have been in a position to extend to many others assistance as these kinds of events take place. Brother Lifrith will now take us through what the mechanics and the logistics as it relates to this purposes of church preparedness. So Dennis, if you'd come forward and then take us through that next segment, please.
Thanks, Bishop.
Excuse me. One
with the questions.
He's way ahead of me. We want to be a little unusual today and invite you to ponder as we go through Dennis's preparation and presentation a couple of questions that we'd like to discuss after he's completed it. But here are some of the things that maybe you keep in mind as the presentation goes forward. Are there additional steps the church should take to help families prepare? And so as you see what we're now doing, are there other things that might come to your attention? In addition to family preparedness, what more should the church do to prepare for emergencies? And 3, what changes should be made to the present strategy? And 4, what should the church do to prepare outside of the U.S. and Canada? We'll come back to each of those questions, but if you just keep those kinds of things in mind, it would help as we get further along in the discussion mode. Thanks, Dennis.
Thank you. I know I speak on behalf of our staff how grateful we are for Bishop Burton and the counselors. It's just a pleasure working with them. And as he mentioned during the last conference, welfare has been busy as a church. We've participated in nearly a disaster, an emergency, one every other day. And this year is no difference. We've had a lot of disasters from Florida and Midwest and Myanmar and Peru and around. And generally, when we look at our approach to disasters, there are three planning levels. One would be local, short-term emergencies, and most of the emergencies we deal with are local, short-term emergencies. Secondly, wide-scale, long-term emergencies. And thirdly, pandemics. So I'd like to take just a few minutes and go through each of these three different planning levels and how the church responds to them. So first of all, the local short-term emergencies such as floods and fires, earthquakes, droughts, and recessions. In response to these, we have leadership and volunteers as perhaps our greatest strength in assisting and helping. Here we have willing members up in Washington during the floods of December 2007, ready and willing to help. Second of all, we have storehouse supplies that are available for those in need. I went down this Welfare Square this morning and met a sister missionary from Honduras. And she told me when she was first assigned to work there at Welfare Square, she walked in and saw all the food, the cans, the labels. She started to cry. She said because during Hurricane Mitch, her family had nothing. And they received the supplies out of the storehouse down in Honduras. And now there's a storehouse in Honduras where they can provide supplies quickly to respond to emergencies right away. This particular storehouse is in Uruguay. In addition to the food, we also have tarps, sleeping wear, clothing, chainsaws in high-risk areas. The second is the meeting houses, a very critical resource we have in the church to respond. In this case, we have the tents set up as shelters in Peru last year during the earthquake. The next slide shows the cultural center being used as a shelter for the fires in California last fall. And thirdly, this warehouse is being used, or the cultural hall is being used as a warehouse in Slidell after Hurricane Katrina. Likewise, the employment centers and LDS Family Services are a great resource to help afterwards. And this is the Slidell Storehouse, still providing help for those who are trying to get on their feet after the flood. Likewise, we have pre-established agreements with other agencies, the Red Cross. And one reason why the church was able to get to Myanmar so quickly just recently is because of pre-established agreements and relationships with CARE and United Parcel Service, who will ship in supplies for us. So it's been very helpful to have these arrangements before the crisis occurs. And lastly, thank goodness we have stake presidents and bishops who are planning at the local level how best to respond with their people. The next level of planning would be wide-scale, long-term emergencies, such as economic depression or collapse, droughts, civil disturbances. And here we have, as our major response, our strategic reserves. And central to this would be our wheat, 8.7 million bushels stored around the United States and Canada, based upon a criteria of providing for about 30% of the members. Beans, 11 million pounds of beans stored mainly in Burley. And we store enough beans to care for the children and the elderly, but not for all other people. Same with rice. And next we have the powdered milk, again for the needy, and we have diesel fuel to move, if we're able to, the product from the farms and from the other storage locations. Here we have a slide that shows where the 30 facilities are in the United States storing the 8.7 million bushels of grain. Next, in terms of response, for long-term emergencies, we have the food processing, the canneries, the milk plant, the granaries, etc., that process the flour. We have farm production. And here we have two different kinds of farms. We have welfare farms. We have about 53 farms in welfare. Most of the product all comes into the system. About 68,000 acres of farmland that is used to produce the wheat, the dry beans, etc. We produce enough wheat to rotate the storage once every 3 years. The second group is run by what we used to call Farm Management Company. FMC is now called Ag Reserves. And they have by far much more land. The productive capacity is really remarkable in this arm of the church. They have about 145,000 acres. They're now producing these products. And in addition to that, they lease out about 244,000 acres that could be converted into productive farmland. Next, on distribution, there are 6 Bishop Central storehouses in the United States. This is Atlanta, Washington, D.C., Indianapolis, Colton, California, Oregon, and Salt Lake. Distribution also, we have 36 trucks, 94 trailers, and the storage of diesel fuel at these strategic locations. Pandemics is a third level of planning. It's different than the other. I met with Red Cross, and they said of all their planning options, pandemics is the most difficult to plan for, simply because of the need to quarantine people. The last couple of years, we've had a number of initiatives taken. Elder Nelson participated back in Washington, D.C. a few months ago and presented what the church is doing to help if there were a pandemic. And the response, as he mentioned, we've recently published for members the 2 brochures that Bishop Burton mentioned, that they should have food available at home. Likewise, information has been published at BYU and other universities to help the students respond if there were a pandemic. We have publications on the website as well that members can then look at. Also, we've prepositioned supplies. Masks, for example, we have 250,000 masks available in these central locations that could be distributed if needed, plus other food and supplies. Likewise, we have communication networks available through the storehouses and stakes and regions of the church. We've worked closely with other agencies, both nationally and locally, to help coordinate and plan and review what could be done. And thirdly, there's been an initiative for some time now looking at what we would do at headquarters in terms of who would come and help manage the operations if there were a pandemic. There are 4 guidelines that we use to govern how we store and produce food. The first is to store a year's supply of basic foods to meet current storehouse needs. So in all of our storehouses, we have about a year's supply of the normal foods for the poor and the needy. Next, we maintain strategic reserves at the 2006 target levels. That's the wheat and the beans we showed earlier. So we made a decision several years ago not to continue expanding that, but to keep it at a certain level and put more focus on families being prepared. Thirdly, we store a year's supply of relief items based on past usage. So over the past many years, we have a pretty good feel of how many chainsaws, wheelbarrows, blankets we need for the hurricane season and other disasters, and we keep about a year's supply on hand for that. And lastly, we produce enough food to replace the annual storehouse needs and rotate 1/3 of the strategic reserves. So that's a summary of the strategy and the approach that the church is now taking. So perhaps, Bishop, we could go back to the questions to see if you'd have any further discussions.
Your colleagues to come forward and introduce them, if you would, please, Dennis.
Good, thanks. Gary Flake, on his way up. He's been the man that's been busy with Myanmar and China and the other issues we're facing. The first one is Kevin Neal. He walked around a different way, but Kevin Neal is he's the director of storehouses, the canneries and the grain storage, production. Next to him is Brett Bass, and Brett Bass is the director of the humanitarian development major initiatives, neonatal resuscitation, vision, immunizations, water, etc., and Gary Flake.
As we advertised as we began the meeting, we'd like to now go to some of these discussions and make it a participatory kind of a day. And, you know, as Latter-day Saints, we always seem to need a little economic incentive to be participants in things. We're a little reluctant debutantes sometimes. And so I had a little meeting with President Packer before the meeting started, and he consented that we could all be considered full tithe payers at 5% if we participated in the discussion. So you get all the blessings, but only half the price. So we'd invite you to participate in the discussion we asked you to ponder is on the board. Brother Sheffield is going to write down some of your comments and ideas. Elder Scott, please.
I wonder if we couldn't be more effective in helping families know how to reach out to their extended family before they turn to the church.
That's an excellent idea. You know, that's always been one of the basic ongoing pillars of our process. Is it difficult to do? It's really difficult to do because many of our bishops don't have the time to help them, counsel them that way, and many of the recipients are reluctant to involve their families. But it's a superb concept and one that needs to be reinforced, I think. So, Lon, we've written down, can we help families be more effective in reaching out to their extended families? And assuming the extended family kind of responsibility. Elder Ballard.
Bishop, how do we know what percentage of our families are really prepared?
Dennis, why don't you respond to that? You've had some recent surveys that are fairly complete.
So last year, before we initiated this new simplified approach, about 10%, 10 to 15% were prepared with food. Internationally, it's 3% or less. So we'll take another survey soon to find out if we made a difference, increased the percentage.
We do that with a quick query, Elder Ballard.
Is that a three month supply?
That'd be the year's supply, or the long term one. Right.
You're talking year or month? Or 3 months?
For 3 months, it's more. It's like 18 to 20% have sufficient for 3 months.
But instead of a quick query, because of the way we're going, I mean the way the world's going, would it be advisable at some point to recommend that we have a survey through the bishops that is more than just a quick query, so we really know what's going on in the families? And I would think we'd want to know whether or not we're really gaining on this thing the way the world's.
I think would be a wise idea for us to do to get together a detailed study on really where we stand. Dennis, please.
I just mentioned that Kevin's keeping track of how much wheat is going outside of the home storage units. It's quadrupled in the last couple of months. So if you had a graph chart all last year, then January, February, March,
Could I ask a question related to that? When you talk about rotating the 3 years, does that go into the system and used, or is it just...
Most of that is sold on the open market.
The rotating portion.
Yeah. Out of the silos.
Because there's not that much need internally.
Elder Oaks, please.
Question on medical supplies, both for home storage and in our storehouses. More and more, as the population ages and for other reasons, we have people who are dependent for life upon a flow of medical supplies. If that were upset, how have we counseled our members, and how are we positioned in our storehouse to help maintain life by other means than food?
Superb question. Anybody like to volunteer an answer or observation?
I'll offer an observation. the storehouses at the present time carry a pretty basic menu of products. Internationally, it's about 20 items on a stock list. In the United States, it's about 120 items on a stock list. Medical, I believe, brings some challenges with having and distributing medicines, particularly if they're prescription medicines. And we probably need to take a look at the kind of parameters we work around on that. But
in the event of a pandemic or some kind of great emergency, I can foresee a time when people are less fussy, the law is less fussy about prescription, and also we don't want to be in a position of being able to maintain a life that's already been surrendered because we couldn't provide
that's
essential medical.
Something we really need to think through because of the laws relating to prescriptions and those kinds of things, and possession of narcotics and so on that are the base of many of that really needs to have some serious thought. Gary, have you got a...
Bishop, Katrina was really a wake-up call on this to a lot of people, and the Red Cross and others are really starting to put an emphasis, and perhaps there's an emphasis that we ought to consider the same, because people that were on dialysis there was a whole group of people that suffered disaster that they didn't need to bring upon themselves besides the disaster that they were already in. And I think that a lot of it's education, and perhaps we need to think about the possibility of reminding people of that.
Not only reminding them from the home, but maybe institutionally, where we can, we may need to have a modicum of those kinds of supplies or expertise to assist. Great question. Any other observations? Yes, please.
I was just reading a study that Michigan did. It's on gardening. It said that 40 years ago, 90% of the population knew how to garden. Today, 90% of the population do not know how to garden. And so I wonder whether we need to teach our members how actually to grow their own food, including in an urban setting, using these kind of window boxes. Because if, in fact, my hunch is that fewer of our members actually know how to grow their own food and become self-sufficient in terms of growing their own food than we might imagine. I mean, that was something which we assumed when I was growing up, but apparently we can't assume it anymore.
I think you're right. We can't assume it. We are doing some limited things there. Why don't you ask the question to Brett? Why don't you respond to what we're doing on the humanitarian side?
Okay. My question had to do with the international church, so to speak. I think there's quite a few countries that have laws prohibiting hoarding or storage of food. And I don't know how far those laws go or which countries are affected, but how can we help those members prepare? Or are they just relying on the grace of the Lord?
Let's hold that one for just a second and respond to the family gardening issue.
We're currently in the process of bringing the Benson Institute from Brigham Young University into welfare services. That's been done. Benson Institute has a lot of experience with that. Alongside that has been an initiative that we've undertaken to help with family gardening. We realize in the emerging church, I will call it, there are many of our members live in urban areas. So we do currently have projects underway that we're piloting to work with priesthood leaders and members of the church in doing these family gardening projects.
Good, please.
Just to follow on, have we thought of, when we build a building, to actually have a plot of land big enough that the ward members could actually grow right at the church itself some food?
We actually have experience with that. Zimbabwe, of all places, is a place where there have been gardens run by members for some time.
And saved the members in Zimbabwe.
It's been a great blessing where they've been able to keep it together and do the work. It's been a great blessing to them. And so I know that has been done in some places.
So we thought of extending that as a kind of in a programmatic kind of way, just for emergencies.
I don't know that we've given it a serious thought, but it's something we should give serious thought to. Thank you for the question. Let's go back to the question relative to hoarding laws or international application. We're going to have one question at the bottom here, discussion relative to what can we do internationally. Maybe let's defer it to that. Maybe
that's fine, sure.
Any other observations? Yes, please.
In terms of helping families prepare, there are present-day pioneers who have great lessons to teach, and they don't live in the developed parts of the world. Where I've been in Africa, they wouldn't have a problem if the electrical grid went down because it goes down every day. They wouldn't have a problem if cell phone towers went down because they aren't up. I think in the established areas of the church would have a real problem if we didn't have microwaves and cell phones. And so there are lessons to learn from people who live that way all the time. And it's not us helping them, but they could help us. And I don't think we facilitate that learning process from present-day pioneers to the people in the established areas who think we get it, when I'm not sure we get it.
Well, I think we're pretty sure we don't get it. Thank you. Yeah, other folks.
On the subject of water, if we had serious disruptions, water would soon be a major source of disease and deprivation and even death. There will be water around, but it'll be polluted. Are we situated in the counsel we've given people for home storage and for central to do water purification?
Brett, do you want to go ahead with that?
Certainly. There are many options that are available, and I believe are quite well known in this North America area. And around the world, people are more and more understanding through the efforts of the World Health Organization and ourselves, boiling water and those types of things. In areas where boiling water is the key, fuel becomes the issue. If filtration, ceramic filters or carbon filters and those things, it's longevity and replacement that becomes the issue. They have a value. And then there's a new type of water purification that is a powder packet that you mix, and it has a shelf life issue and also fairly technical instructions that go with it. And you add to that bleach and iodine. And those are all of the options. As we've communicated in our water storage pamphlets that Kevin knows about, we talk about the basics of water purification, but it's not global. It doesn't meet cultural needs. We talk about boiling water, and in Sudan you don't boil water. So there is a sensitivity that we could, in our materials and our approach, we could be more sensitive to those things.
Kevin, anything you want to...
I would just say that in a country like ours, much of what we're talking about probably goes back to the very basic message to having some water on hand that is safe. And then there is that much larger challenge of dealing with it on a more long-term basis. But the council to lay up and store and set some things aside seems to be one of the things that needs to be continually taught, and at least moving in that direction with the individual family.
I think at the personal level, I warrant that very, very few families would have a 3-month supply of water.
No, very few.
And if they don't, we ought to have specific options for them to approximate a 3-month supply of water by purification supplies.
Good point. Dennis, you had your hand halfway. Okay.
Is that even feasible, a 3-month supply of water?
Right now we're encouraging a 2-week supply.
2 weeks.
And further observations on the first discussion question? Let's go to the second one in the interest of time. In addition to family preparedness, what more should the church do to prepare for emergencies? We've named some of those, thank you, as we've gone through the first question, but let's focus on emergencies. Now, these are the acts of God, Mother Nature, generally speaking, we're talking about here, rather than the family emergencies of dislocation or financial reversals or those kinds of things. Anything come to mind that would be helpful for us as we try to think through family preparedness and what more should the church do to prepare for emergencies? In addition to family preparedness, you can think of. Let us tell you then just briefly what's taking place in the two situations that are most current. Gary, would you first tell them what we're doing in Myanmar, and then what the proposal is for China.
Dennis alluded a little bit to this. Through having the organizational connections and knowing where some of these organizations are successful, we knew that CARE had been in Myanmar for a long time and had a good relationship there. And our couples, we have 2 couples with humanitarian assignments, knew of that association. So we made contact with them. We provided $200,000 that they have been able to make purchases in country and distribute to 15,000 families since it occurred. Regardless of the politics and the borders and all of that, we've been able to provide resources and have reports from them and respond. Based upon that, then the United Parcel Service came to us and said, we know of your medical supplies, and working with CARE, both of them out of Atlanta, can we pick up MD-11 full of medical supplies and deliver them to CARE in Bangkok, who will go ahead and get them in smaller shipments into Myanmar without raising the fanfare of all of the border and this sort of thing because of the relationships. So we're, in that case, working through the organization, working very closely with the area presidency, of course, and having the couples on the ground to try to provide some sort of a truth squad of where we're at. There's another organization or 2 that we're looking at and considering, but that's where we're at on Myanmar.
The Appropriations Committee set aside $500,000 for those endeavors with the proviso that we could review that when that was gone. Now in terms of China, please.
We began immediately with China, visiting with the area presidency and Brother Terry Oaks, the DTA, of what they would like to do, and suggested a few options to them. And then they came back and have said, what we would like to do is to involve what members we can, and we like this very much, in Hong Kong or elsewhere in making hygiene kits. Following the tsunami, the saints in Hong Kong made 30,000 hygiene kits and shipped them out to Sri Lanka, and it was a great blessing to them. So the proposal is that they would like to make someplace between 30 to 50,000 hygiene kits as soon as they can and get them in, working either directly with the Ministry of Civil Affairs in China through the connections that Elder Chen and others have, or that they would work through the All China Women's Charity Group, one of the groups that they've been working with. And then the other things they would do would be to look for the niches, the tents, the blankets, other things that can be purchased in China, and keep it as a response within China, of the church responding in China. So that's the way that we're moving on that at this point. It seems very wise to me.
On Tuesday, we will present an appropriation request to the Budget and Appropriations for $1 million to support that endeavor in China.
But again, I think my credit is to them, the association relationships that they have built in China, that when one of these comes along, then it allows us to fit into the stream of where they're going.
Bishop,
Please, Elder Hales.
on this point, don't you have church planning, emergency preparedness by local stakes, areas and such for emergencies like flooding?
We do indeed. And
isn't that ongoing?
That's ongoing, and you'll recall in Dennis's presentation, the bottom item was an expression of appreciation for those wards and stake plans that are out there.
Bishop, can I make just one other comment on the United States? With some of the fires and other things we're doing. In the United States, we've made a conscious effort the last couple of years to absolutely, as a church, respond directly and use priesthood leaders. Of course, in Myanmar, we've got to have a third-party organization to work with. We don't have to have that here. We know that we can respond directly, and the volunteers and the other things that are involved. But one of the interesting things to me, as the church considers emergency preparation, is that we have members of the church literally in every little town in America. I am just amazed. When a tornado hits Northcutt, North Dakota, or flooding in Joliet, Illinois, and we start to look into it, there's always 4 or 5 or 6 families of the church, and then they've got some connections. And I used to think these little towns across America, we didn't have any church members. we're finding just a lot of the tornadoes last week in Joplin, Missouri, working with President Jones and through Elder Anderson, of course. There are 18 church member families had significantly damaged homes because of that tornado. It's just the increase in church members, so emergency preparedness as a church is even greater, I feel, as we have larger numbers of members.
Thank you for those. Any other items before we go to the next discussion point? What changes should be made in our present strategy? Obviously, there are some strategic suggestions in some of the ideas that have been presented, but strategically, you'll remember what our storehouses have, the beans, the wheat, and so on. Are there any suggestions for what we can do differently given the restraints that we have in any kind of a long-term dislocation?
What is the current understanding of a bishop, for example, as it relates to an emergency response? In other words, something's happening. Are we training the bishoprics sufficiently that they know who to go to and where to go in response to?
I think in the United States and Canada, the coordinating council and the discussion that's gone on there, and the grouping together of stakes to respond to one another's issues is pretty well established, and that they know that they have not only their stake organization, but they have the multi-stake organizations that are ready to jump in. Maybe the members of the 7 presidents have a better perspective than we do on that issue. Any observations, President Tingey and your colleagues?
No, I think what you said is accurate.
Internationally, it's a different picture. And though we've got a number of places where the helping hands idea is percolating, I'm not sure it's to the level that we have at other places.
Bishop?
Please.
Out in the poorest parts of the church, Peru, El Salvador, Bolivia, and especially among the rural poor, well, really all poor, for them, an emergency is an increase in the price of food.
That's true.
Beyond what they can afford. It doesn't have to be a calamity. And I know you're talking about emergency preparedness, but what are we doing and how does our strategy deal with that kind of a problem, where people simply suddenly drop from being poor to being destitute and even having their lives in danger? How can we make sure that everybody gets fed?
Well, theoretically, it's education of our bishops. Our bishops have that responsibility, and the generosity of the saints as it relates to keeping the sacredness and of the fast. Last year, a little over nearly $300 million was used by our bishops in terms of cash, let alone the commodities, to react to some of those issues. For members of the church, we think it's at the unit level, and it's the bishop who has the checkbook without a balance, so to speak, that can reach out and help in those kinds of situations. As an institution, that's our preparedness as it relates to our members in those areas. Is it a perfect situation? Do we have perfect administration? We have a long way to go to get that, but that's the basic premise which we operate. Dennis, something you'd like to add?
It is. It's a serious problem with many of these members, as we all know. And I think the last time we came into the full general committee, we talked about trying to help through employment. We had a kind of a 3-pronged approach with placing in jobs if jobs are available, helping them develop a skill, and small business through microcredit, microloans available in the community. I think in the long term we have an approach. But the short term, with the rising price of food, it's a serious issue for many families.
Just look at a member who lives in a ward where we built a $100,000 meeting house, which is more than the entire ward will make in 10 years, and they wonder why we can't find a way to feed them. I mean, that's what I'm talking about.
Well, that's a tragedy if that occurs, because the means are there if the priesthood leaders are doing what they're asked to do. Please, Kevin.
In the where international storehouses have been established in Latin America, in the larger cities where the people are in a reasonable distance of that storehouse, the bishop can help them immediately with food. Now, obviously, there are people who live more distance that becomes...
And we're not as pervasive as with storehouses internationally as we could be. And one of the questions we'll have here, we'll talk about that issue. Thank you. Elder Scott and then Brother Wood.
The reality that I've seen overseas is that a few people come to the bishop and ask, but the real needy don't, and they don't go out to evaluate those who are in need. It's a very serious problem.
But the scripture says the bishop should seek out the poor.
Yeah, the magic word is seek, and that comes with training.
To happen.
Yeah, exactly.
The thing's in place to do it, but it's not being done.
That's what needs to change.
Well, his only prayer is the ward council operating properly on
his
this.
Ward council and his Quorum's Relief Society, of course, who are the members of that council. Was there a handle here? Yes.
I wonder if we need to. We used to do it a fair bit when I was young, but we don't do it much anymore. Do we need to teach our members basic competencies in Relief Society and our quorum meetings? I think about it. My father, in terms of being a Robinson Crusoe, would have a far greater chance of survival than I would. And I would bet that I have a better chance of survival than my grandchildren will. That we're losing basic competency, particularly being a Robinson Crusoe in an urban environment, including a developed society. But even if I've noticed that even in Brazil, where people, when they first come into the city, they know how to cope. When it gets to the generation thereafter, they don't know how to cope anymore. I mean, in an honest way. And I'm wondering whether we need to teach competencies, which we haven't done in a long time in most of our...
It's a excellent question, good question. We ought to make certain we've got that on the horizon here. I think you're exactly right. Any other items before we hit the last one? What should we do to prepare outside of the U.S. and Canada?
It looked like at our first Wednesday meeting that while we have all of this welfare storage and we have this magnificent for-profit, that in the places that things are most likely to be terrible, Africa, Philippines, that we have neither storage nor do we have farms or ranches or anything else. Is there a plan, or should there be a plan for those that we know are perennially going to be the most difficult places in the world? And do we have a backup plan to even utilize and get things there?
It's an excellent question, and at this point in time we have, by strategy, focused on those few places in the world where the soils are the best, where we can be more profitable, and probably we're a little myopic when it comes to that. Good observation. We have not considered the acquisition as a part of the providing of resources every place. And that probably is a great suggestion.
Could you address the hoarding issue?
Yeah, thank you for reminding me. Kevin or Brett, the issues surrounding, in some places it's not appropriate legally for members to acquire a food supply in their basement or have an unusual amount of food on hand.
My response to that would be, in many of those places, this country not being one that we're in now, the idea might be, instead of having a few pounds of food on hand that takes us for a couple of days, that maybe we work to have enough pounds of food on hand to take us for a couple of weeks. Now, whether that would be considered hoarding in a given country, I don't know, but it may be that basic.
Brett, as you've looked around the humanitarian endeavors, tell us about your experience there.
In most of the areas where we're doing humanitarian work, there may be those kinds of laws, but they're not enforced. Number one, there's very little enforcement. Number two, I have seen where they recommend then have cash or something to barter so you can acquire. And I actually was in a high priest group in Kenya where they were discussing that very fact, that they weren't able to store. At that time, the 3-month thing hadn't been released, and they were talking about how can we be liquid enough to be able to get what we need from each other.
You resort to a barter system, perhaps. I raise a few pigs and you do something else, and we exchange. Any other suggestions, brethren? We've had you for nearly the hour, but are there some things, any feelings, any perceptions from you or anybody else in the audience, for that matter, about where we're going, what we're doing? Please, Elder.
I think one thing we might do to a greater extent than we now do is regionalize this question, and instead of trying to do it at headquarters, say to people in Ghana or say to people in the Philippines, what do you think is the solution to this problem? We can't solve this. You know your local conditions. We might regionalize to a greater planning and counsel to people to a greater extent than we've done.
I think that's a good suggestion. You know, the basic underlying pillars of policy and so on are the same around the world, but how you do it can be vastly different.
For instance, in the Philippines, as Brother Ballard and I were just talking about, the coping skills are way up here. They've got a lot of problems, but they are survivors, and they know how to cope. And so we ought to be saying to them, what can we do to help you in these emergencies? And their coping skills are applied to that situation, and they could give better counsel out of Manila for the needs of 500,000 members of the Philippines than we could ever possibly give out of headquarters.
Great observation. Yes, please.
Bishop, I just want to comment. I think these simplified pamphlets that you've distributed, well, I sure see them used a lot when I go out, and they seem to have been a real blessing to the...
We hope that's the case. I hope the simplified approach came out of a General Welfare Committee discussion that we had not too long ago, and I think it's paid dividends. Thank you for your participation, your ideas, and thank you for the time. And thanks to my esteemed colleagues for really carrying the ball today. We are grateful for the opportunity of sharing with you. Thank you.